Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a fascinating and, honestly, an incredibly impactful piece of history. We're going to explore how a single colonial decision, made way back in 1914, laid down a fundamentally flawed foundation. And as you'll see, it's a foundation that directly drives Nigeria's modern-day struggles with resource control, governance, and ethnic tension.
Now, to really get a nation, you kind of have to understand its origins, right? So I want to kick things off by asking you a rather surprising question. Who actually gave Africa's most populous nation its name? You might assume it was a local leader, an ancient king, or maybe some grand consensus among its indigenous peoples. But the real origin story? It's much more unexpected than that.
Believe it or not, it was a British journalist named Flora Shaw. Back in 1897, she was writing an article for the Times of London discussing the territories governed by the British Royal Niger Company. Well, she found phrases like the Niger Territories just a bit too clunky for her writing, so she simply suggested a shorter, more practical name based on the River Niger that flows right through the region. She coined the word Nigeria, and amazingly, that name stuck. Actually, as a quick side note, she'd later go on to marry the very man who fused this massive territory together.
Which brings us to our first section, the origin of a nation.
Okay, picture this. Before Nigeria was a single, unified country, the British administered this vast area as two completely separate regions, the Northern Protectorate and the Southern Protectorate. And the differences between them were massive. I mean, night and day. The North was largely Islamic, governed through indirect rule using traditional emirs, but it was really struggling financially. The South, on the other hand, was incredibly wealthy from coastal trade, heavily influenced by Western education, and managed through direct British rule. We are talking about a vast cultural and economic asymmetry right from the starting line.
So let's track this timeline real quick. In 1897, Flora Shaw suggests the name. By 1900, the British formally established the Northern and Southern Protectorates as separate entities. Then comes the absolute pivotal moment in 1914, the Amalgamation. This is where these distinctly different regions are artificially stitched together into modern Nigeria. And incredibly, that very same structure remained in place all the way through to their independence in 1960.
Moving on to our next section, the motives behind the merger.
So why do this? Well, spearheaded by Governor-General Lord Frederick Lugard, this merger was, quite frankly, strictly about British economic and administrative expediency. It wasn't done for the benefit of the local communities. The British urgently needed to reduce their high administrative costs. Because the North was running a severe deficit, they figured they'd use the wealth generated in the South to basically subsidize the Northern administration. Plus, they needed to harmonize the competing railway lines down to the coast to efficiently exploit and ship local raw materials back to Europe. Bottom line, it was a business decision, plain and simple.
And you really have to understand Lord Lugard's style here. He had a very strict military background, and he operated with absolute top-down authority. He bluntly declared that every resident shall be removable from one province to another at the discretion of the High Commissioner. He was transferring staff and dictating policy without tolerating any constructive criticism. Sure, that military-style precision worked for securing territory, but it set a highly dangerous precedent for autocratic, centralized control over what was a very complex civilian population.
That leads us right into our next section, the flaws in the foundation.
When a nation is essentially created just for the administrative convenience of an outside power, cracks are absolutely going to appear. Over 250. Think about that for a second. That is the number of distinct ethnic groups that were suddenly lumped together under one single administration in 1914, and they were grouped together entirely without their consent. The British literally didn't consult the indigenous populations to ask if they even wanted to be part of this huge new administrative unit.
The British basically forced these incredibly heterogeneous groups together without considering their deep cultural, religious, and economic differences. By completely ignoring those on-the-ground realities, the 1914 amalgamation instantly sowed the seeds of ethnic power struggles. It's wild to think about, but the mutual suspicions and regional rivalries that were hardwired into the country back then, those are the exact same issues the nation is still untangling today.
Next up, the oil boom and fiscal shift.
So what happens when this incredibly fragile colonial foundation suddenly collides with massive oil wealth? Well, to get that, we first need to quickly understand the derivation principle. Simply put, it's a fiscal system where regions get to keep a significant chunk of the money generated from the natural resources pulled out of their own land. And here's what's absolutely crucial to know. Right after independence, during Nigeria's First Republic, regions were actually allowed to keep up to 50% of their local resource wealth.
But take a look at this data.
The shift is just staggering. From 1960 to 1969, producing states kept a solid 50% of the revenue. But then by the late 70s, it drops to 20%. By the 1980s, the producing states are getting a measly 1.5% of their resource wealth, with a whopping 98.5% being siphoned off to the Central Federation account. Today, it sits at around 13%. This table right here perfectly illustrates the massive, deliberate fiscal centralization that took over the country.
You might be wondering, how did the central government legally manage to take all that wealth away from the regions? The sources we're looking at detail a series of military decrees in the 1970s that systematically stripped resource control away from local communities. The 1969 Petroleum Decree vested all oil in the federal government. Then, the 1971 Decree No. 9 nationalized offshore oil. And finally, the 1978 Land Use Act literally took land rights directly away from local communities and handed them to the state. This whole architecture of decrees effectively hoovered up the nation's wealth right into the hands of the federal government.
Which brings us to our final section, modern federal contradictions. Let's connect this century-old history of centralization directly to the agitations we see today. Remember how the British started with just 2 protectorates, and at independence there were only 3 regions? Well, today, in an attempt to manage all those ethnic tensions and demands for representation, Nigeria has been balkanized into 36 separate states, along with 774 local governments. But here is the massive contradiction. Despite being broken down into all these smaller pieces, most of these 36 states remain completely, 100% financially dependent on the federal center.
Because the federal government still controls over 50% of the national revenue, mostly from oil, it has created what scholars call a rentier federalism. What does that mean? It means instead of generating their own revenue and organically developing their local economies, states are practically forced to just constantly lobby the capital, Abuja, for their monthly financial survival. And why does this matter to us? Because this deep structural imbalance directly fuels feelings of marginalization, completely stifles local autonomy, and triggers those relentless, ongoing demands for true federalism.
All right, so where do we go from here? The scholars and sources we've analyzed outline a few highly recommended steps for genuine nation building to finally start correcting these historical mistakes. First, a constant constitutional review to actually adjust to the needs of these diverse ethnic groups. Second, a deliberate effort to check the marginalization of minority groups, making sure they get a fair share of national wealth and appointments. And third, transparent governance that finally moves away from self-centered politics and fully embraces genuine accountability. We've seen how Lord Lugard stitched this massive country together back in 1914, purely for administrative cost-cutting and resource extraction. And we've seen how that foundational flaw spread like wildfire, leading to decades of centralized wealth and local deprivation. So, I want to leave you with this final thought. Can a nation that was artificially merged for colonial profit truly restructure itself? Can it overcome its deep, century-old scars and finally achieve equitable resource control for all its people? It is a giant puzzle for sure, but understanding this history, that's the very first step.